Yeah, I think this is going to be really interesting because just in contrast to the other presentation, my work has mostly been with more kind of enterprise types of applications, and so my customers are more oriented towards solving a business problem. But one thing that I really resonated with in the other presentation was the importance of design, and that's actually the whole topic of my presentation is why is why aren't we there we go. Yeah, what kind of design techniques you can use to design the natural language part of an application. So we're going to talk about the initial design process for a virtual assistant, a very, very upstream, what Alarna was talking about, the planning phase, and right past the planning phase. How do we get a really well-designed application that's usable and really important, maintainable? So we're going to talk about why design, how do you identify the intents and entities that are going to be part of your design. And again, this is the natural language part of the application. It's we're not really going to talk about the conversation design. That's really, really important, but we're focusing more on just the content of the exchanges with the user. Why should you design? Well, the current toolkits like Alexa and Google and Microsoft Lewis and Nuance Mix, they're incredibly easy to use, and they're almost too easy to use, and they kind of lure you into this, let's just get started. Let's start working on our application without thinking about exactly what kinds of things you want to be able to do with it. You can do that with, if you're just kind of fooling around with the toolkit or doing a demo or making a prototype like this prototype phonograph. But for real applications, you should really take your time and do the right planning and data collection and design. So natural language understanding is basically the process of taking what the user says and organizing it in some way that a computer can process it. That how that content is organized is up to the designer, and it involves a lot of choices. In particular, we're going to talk about intents and entities. Just a quick refresher on what an intent is. It's the user's goal in making the utterance. Why did they even speak? What are they trying to accomplish? It's a high-level characterization of the user's input. Usually applications have a lot of intents because they do a lot of different things. And so that's part of the design is how many intents and how are you going to organize them. The other aspect of the semantics of user inputs is the entities. They're the details that you need to fulfill intents, and they're going to answer questions like when, where, how many, how often, which, that apply to the intents. And we'll see a lot of examples of those. Well, what if you just plunge right in and start designing with your great toolkit? Let's say you're doing some kind of a shopping assistant. You get some data, your very first data from a user, and the user says, show me boys' shirts. Great, let's do an intent. How about show shirts? And maybe it has an entity of a wearer, and the wearer is a boy, and that's a great structure for that utterance. So you get another data, show me girls' sweaters, and you think, oh, okay, well, obviously girls is another Um, it's another entity, it's another where, so that's another an entity that I need. Um, so let's have a intent called show sweaters. Okay, then we're marching along, we get another piece of data that says show me boys pants. And then we start to get a little bit worried that are we going to have an intent for show every possible kind of clothing? That's starting to sound wrong. Um, so, you know, show socks and show shoes and show scarves. Um, that's just doesn't seem right. So let's have something more general, like show clothes. And what happens when we do that? It means our other intents are obsolete now. So we have to get rid of those and analyze our data to have an intent of show clothes, which and maybe we have a new entity, which is the item of clothing. So we have to go back and change the old data. And if the data goes back to this some kind of database with the actual inventory in it, you're going to have to remap some of the connection between the utterances and the backend API, and that's a huge amount of work. So we want to avoid that by doing a good design process up front. So how do we find these intents? We have two strategies that you can use. They both work and they can work together. There's a top-down strategy and there's a bottom-up strategy. So the top-down strategy is you can ask a couple of questions. First of all, you can ask what is the purpose of the overall application? What does it do? And interestingly, sometimes that gives you some good ideas for intents. And then you can also look if you have an API to a backend application, um, you can get some ideas for intents from that. So what does the application do? How does that help? We have different categories of applications. We have applications that help you learn. We have applications to help you control things. They're entertaining applications and shopping. There's all different purposes of applications. But if you, for example, are doing a smart home application where you control things, you're going to have a lot of um, potential intents like turning on and turning off, raising, lower the blinds or raise the temperature. So those will give you some good ideas for what kind of intents there might be in your application. The other place where it's pretty interesting, you can get some pretty interesting intents by looking at the back end that you're connecting with. So this example is from the actual United States Postal Service API, which they have a public API, which I think is very nice. And so the user could say something like, where's my laptop tracking number 12345? It gets understood by a natural language processing system, and then it's put into a structured format where there's an intent called track request, a tracking number, and maybe a user ID that you got from the user's login process. And then there's an actual, this is a real API call, and you see that there's a track request in there, user ID, and a tracking ID that the designers of the back end or whatever database or whatever implements that, they've already decided that there should be something called a track request with a couple of parameters which look a lot like an intent and a couple of entities that you could use in your application. Um, some of the So those are the top-down approaches. Some of the bottom-up approaches are kind of interesting. Um, There's two approaches. One is looking at any data that you might have, and another one that you might not think of is looking at some of the things that are happening on a web page that you're providing, that you may be providing the same information as a web page. So first we'll look at data. In a natural language system, data is the things that the users say. It's the basis of machine learning of natural language, which is by far the most common technology that supplies natural language understanding in current systems. And so, yeah, so you can look at data, see what you have in there, see what people are saying. Of course, the more data, the better. Sometimes, if you have any real data, that's great. You might have, for some applications, you might actually have things like call center logs, so you know what the users are saying, or chat logs if there's some kind of like a human chat. There's all things like you can actually do experiments with what's called a Wizard of Oz approach, where you have a human simulate the system and have people ask questions. You don't have real data. There's lots of different ways of getting synthetic data. It's not as trustworthy as real data because it's made up, but it's better than nothing. You can invent utterances. You can use some grammars or regular expressions to generate possible utterances in your application. You can kind of reverse engineer the backend API, which we kind of saw a minute ago. And if there's a database, you can also look at the names of the tables and fields. Now, I said that you can look at the website activity trackers, and I think this is a really fun way to get information, because if you think about it, a web page is often supplying pretty much the same information that you would supply with your app, and so users are interacting with it for some of the same purposes. So if you look at what's going on with your web page, you can get some ideas for intents. So here's my web page, and I've instrumented it with a tool called Hotjar, which provides analytics on how people are using your page. So you can see all these dots all over the page. Those are places where people have clicked or hovered over the page. And right away you can see that there's been a lot of traffic clicking this one button on the top, which happens to be services. So if I'm going to develop a bot or a virtual assistant for this page, I would definitely have services as one of my intents, because that's what people are doing a lot with that page. So let's say you've used all these tools and you've come up with some intent candidates. You have to you want to, if you've come across some duplicates, you want to combine those. There might be a lot of different ideas you've had about package tracking, for example. You have to be aware of platform limitations. They all have some kinds of limits. So if you get working with one of the platforms that has a lower limit on intents, you have to make sure that you don't have more than it can handle, or more than. Sometimes you can have more if you pay more, but you need to be aware of that. So that's intents. We can't consider intents in isolation, because we also have our companion information in the form of entities. So how do we find entities? The first thing you want to do, you have some intents. Let's say you look at intents and see what needs to be more specific. So here's an example of an intent that you might have in a local business search application. You're looking for a restaurant, and we have all this additional information that could flesh out my question about restaurants. I could just say, what's a good restaurant? That's pretty vague. There might be a few million answers to that. So you would probably want to narrow it down at least to a good restaurant near here. And you might want a cuisine, or you might want a price range. You might want a quality, you might want a good one, or you might want a superb one. All of those things are going to be entities that that go along with that intent. So again, we have a top-down and a bottom-up approaches. You can look at the API for a top-down approach and see what kinds of things are being used to get information out of the database. And here we have our same API call to the Postal Service database. And it has the track requests that we turned into an intent, and the user ID and the tracking ID. For a bottom-up approach, you can look at data for each intent and see what else is mentioned in those intents. So a tracking request might have a tracking ID. And probably we could have a user ID too. You could say my user ID is 12345. One category of intents that you should always think about is what you might almost call universal intents. They're almost always a possibility. So the universal intents might be things like time, place, and recurrence. So if you don't say anything about time, place, or recurrence, you would have an utterance like, let's say, turn on the lights. That would mean turn on the lights here, now, only one time. But what I've seen is you forget about those universal entities, and then when you get the utterance, turn on the lines at the kitchen, you have to scramble around and maybe reanalyze your data to add a location. So you would think, as part of your planning process, I think considering that you might have these situations right at the outset would make your life a lot easier. So we have intents, we have entities, but it turns out that they're not independent, and they're not independent in interest for interesting reasons. And designers can organize them in different ways. One reasoning behind how they might be organized is has to do with platform limitations. We talked about that, but there's other choices that we might need to make. So I like to think of 3 different types of intents. The simple intents are just basically just a verb is the most common kind. So I'm looking for boys' shirts. Your intent might be look for, and all the rest of the information in that sentence can be put into entities. If you want to, you can put some of that, something that might otherwise be considered an entity, into the intent name. So if you said, I'm looking for boys' shirts, you might say, look for clothes is going to be your intent. You actually add some of the meaning about the boys' shirts into the intent. And I call that a compound intent because it has the action and then the thing that you're looking for. There's another kind of interesting intent that I call a Gricean intent, where you're saying something that's kind of indirect, and what your real intent is has to kind of be figured out from what you said. So something like, my son is outgrowing his shirts. That doesn't have anything to do with looking for clothes on the surface, but it means look for clothes. And the user is kind of stating their interest in an indirect way that the system would have to figure out. So how would you decide about the compound intent versus the simple intent in entities? If you have a lot of entity values, like something like countries, states, dates, you need to have those. Can't be folded into the intent, especially if there's, you know, pretty much an infinite number like dates. You can't have one intent for February 23rd, 2000 or 2021. Reusable entities should be pulled out of intents and put into entities. Like if you use cities in several different intents, they should be pulled out as entities. And just, you know, you can get ridiculous if you make intents too specific. Like you don't want to have a intent called look for boys short sleeve shirts. You want to pull some of that meaning out into entities. Balancing that is, in terms of machine learning, that usually the accuracy of a machine learning classification process is a little bit better with intents. So that's kind of pulling you toward the direction of having more intents. So these things all need to be balanced out. So some other things that we want to think about. I've talked about machine learning considerations. I've talked about the platform capabilities you have to take into account. The 2 points on the bottom really have to do with the human, the people that are actually assigning intents and entities to new data. It's pretty easy if you have a lot of data to start being especially if you have a lot of similar intents. It's pretty easy to start being confused about what you did in the past, and making inconsistent notations, annotations. And similarly, there's another kind of entity that we haven't talked about. Some platforms support complex entities, which are, again, they're hard, they're interesting, but they're hard for users to keep, or annotators to keep track of. So just to finish up, designing your intents and entities ahead of time saves effort in the long run. We have looked at a lot of bottom-up and top-down techniques, and pointed out how their intents and entities are interdependent, and how do we work out how to structure them to have a good design. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Deborah. I really appreciate that. We had a question from Jeremy, who noticed that you talked about something like a nuance mix. Actually, this was some SH, and that's kind of not your typical dialogue flow or Alexa or other sorts of platforms. So when do you see that sort of tool being useful versus kind of the more common ones? Like, do they each have like a niche, or how would you decide which tool to use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've had applications where I started out with, well, probably more often the Microsoft Lewis tool, and graduated to Nuance because the application was more complicated. Nuance had a really small limits on entities, and any kind of, most applications will outgrow that. But I guess the other axis of comparison is not just capabilities, but having a smart speaker type of application. And I think it's really interesting. I think the something like Nuance or Lewis or the IBM Watson they're older than the smart speaker. Well, their genre is older. They're not all older, but and I think they tend to be more used in mobile or web types of applications, or even phone applications, rather than smart speaker applications, and that are more enterprise oriented.
Okay. When you're talking about kind of the risk of too many intents and the drawbacks of that, how do you know you've reached too many? Like, is there some rule of thumb, or how would you kind of gauge that?
Well, you know what the limits of the platform are. If it only supports 250 intents, then don't use more than 250 intents. But there's other things that can. One problem is if you need to have a reasonable amount of data for each intent. So if you have, it depends, the different platforms would handle it differently, or would start to break down. But if, let's say, you had one utterance in your training data per intent, that won't work. So you need to have a good amount of data. And some platforms will do some analytics for you and tell you that some of your intents are too close together. So in fact, you might look at the intents, and the reason they get confused is because their meanings are really, really close. So you don't want to have intents that are so close together that they get confused. So then you would want to consolidate them. But yeah, how many I mean, there's no, like, other than the platform limits, there's no hard and fast rule about how many intents you can have.
Okay. So Matthew, like what you said about sometimes the platforms make it too easy to get started without kind of really thinking everything through, or having a good plan in mind. Is there sort of anything you would do differently, like if you were working for one of these platforms, to better guide users, or kind of help avoid that?
Yeah, I have lately. I have been working more with Nuance, and they in their training material, which they have a lot of good training material, they tell you do some planning before you start. But that's good. I mean, that's good. But other than having some good training material, I don't know what else the platform itself could do. You know, they really want to make it easy to develop applications. So I don't think they want to put barriers like you have to have 20 intents and 200 utterances before you can start. I think that would be kind of discouraging. But
Yeah.
I certainly have been on the unpleasant end of having to redo my application all over again because we discovered something new.
What do you feel about the kind of prototype style of tools where you don't even have any real code. You just almost like storyboard something together, and you just follow a prescribed path. So rather than like training data and NLP, you just sort of walk through the flow with almost some like given commands and see how it feels.
You mean before you do the industrial
Yeah.
strength? That I haven't actually used anything like that, but I think that could be pretty useful, especially if you're using it for some initial testing with users, because users will do things that you don't expect, and it's better to know that as soon as possible.
Great. All right, I think we're right at the end of our time slot here. Wanted to thank you and Alarna again, and really appreciate your spending time with us and helping us educate and learn more together. So thank you both, and we'll be in touch to get decks that we can share out from you and get the recording out to everyone as well.
Thank you. That was great. I really appreciate your invitation.
Thank you. So for Bots and AI, we're definitely planning to have more online events. We've got a good upcoming speaker pipeline. But as always, if you have other topics you'd like us to cover, or if you'd like to be a speaker, want to recommend a speaker, definitely reach out to humans@botsandai.com. And we'll leave you to the rest of your evening now. Thank you.